we've got a special guest here tonight. We've got Dr. Guy Hatchard, and we're going to be talking about the Gene Technology Bill. And so what are the health impacts? So how could deregulation of gene technology affect our food supply and our well-being? What are the implications for the environment? So does genetic modification endanger New Zealand's ecosystem? And then what are the economic threats? Because we have built up a brand New Zealand for our farming and our food industry. We have such a reputation. So how will that impact there? So if people want to know a lot more about Guy Hatchard and his work, it's all in here. So submission template for the Gene Technology Bill, if you click on that, it takes you to an article he's posted in January. And it explains how to make a submission, how to inform your friends, and so on. So if we go on that, it takes you to the Parliament's site. So under Parliament, they've got the Gene Technology Bill there, and the closing date for submissions is Monday, 17th of February, which is next Monday. So you've got less than a week to do it if you want to do it. So you can click on the button, I'm ready to make my submission, and so on. And if you're still in any doubt, come back to the meetup site, and there's a few more explanations. So that's the Gene Technology Bill itself on the New Zealand Parliament site. And the explanation that Guy has done before is available through YouTube. As well. Oh, sorry, Rumble, not YouTube.
It seems, you know, I mean, tragically, we've arrived at a point where the government has decided to completely deregulate biotechnology in spite of the 5 years of the pandemic, the cumulative economic misery, the now almost widely and universally accepted lab origin of COVID. So the question is, really, where do we go from here? We do have an opportunity until February the 17th to make a submission, and you should, because the New Zealand First MPs that we have been able to speak to, we are not all of them, but one or two, say that the position that the party takes will basically be influenced by how many submissions are received. The problem with gene technology is absolutely fundamental. Life begins with a single cell, and for every organism, and that single cell contains everything about that individual organism, whether it's a person or a plant or an animal, the aspirations, the creativity, the intelligence, the health. Absolutely everything is contained in that first cell. And the cell consists of the nucleus containing the DNA, the cytoplasm, which contains about 40 million proteins, and the cellular protective membrane or cover. And these three work as an integrated system, as a whole system. And what gene technology has done is to work out how to bypass the protective cell membrane and alter what goes on inside the cell. And that puts the whole organism, the organizing power of the whole organism, at risk. It's simple. And that has been known for many years. Gene technology of various types and approaches in order to particularly aimed at solving single gene mutation illnesses has been going on for 40 years. And basically, it's a history of problems and side effects. And then in 2019, with the advent of more exact gene editing techniques, so-called CRISPR techniques, it was supposed that these more exact techniques would be free of adverse effects. And so there was an article published in Nature magazine in 2019 which said, looking back, it's a history of problems. Looking forward, we're very hopeful. But as it's turned out, studies published since then have shown that CRISPR gene editing is associated with off-target effects, with chromosomal mutations, and we're back to square one. But we're not back to square one because a few people made billions of dollars during the pandemic and they don't want it to stop. They want that sort of deregulated environment which occurred during the pandemic when they were simply allowed to market the vaccine worldwide without any long-term testing, without any adequate warnings for people, without any without any safeguards. It was marketed as being just a vaccine, a new kind of vaccine. In fact, it didn't work and it had a very high rate of side effects, as you know. But now we've arrived at this point where people absolutely don't want it to stop. And there's a lot of money at stake. There's a lot of power at stake. There's a lot of influence coming from America. There's a lot of influence coming from the pharmaceutical industry through organizations like ICMA. ICMA is the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities. New Zealand is a member. It's not a governmental body. It's just a loose association of people who regulate medicines all over the world. It's funded by the pharmaceutical industry, and our MedSafe is tied in to their database and basically receives instructions from them, how to proceed, what things to regulate, what things to ban, what things to encourage, and so on. We're up against an international system with its kind of fantasies, really, because a lot of what's in gene technology is pure fantasy. When you look at the actual outcomes, we occasionally see an article in the paper that says someone miraculously recovered from cystic fibrosis or some other gene mutation disease. When you actually look at the statistics, they're horrifying. Most people, the effects last for a short time. The side effects are humongous. I mean, for example, treatment of cystic fibrosis, which is a single gene mutation, you have to go through chemotherapy as an adjunct to the procedure. And in a lot of people, it fails, and it costs $3.65 million per person. This is what we're being offered with gene technology. It's certainly not going to change our health outcomes in New Zealand. And it's a very, very risky technology. And that's another feature of what has come along with the pandemic is what the pharmaceutical companies are hoping for is that there'll be more leniency about adverse effects. There was a case in point a couple of days ago where it's turned out that there are a lot of cases coming to light now, people who are taking Ozempic, the weight loss drug, who are going blind. And Novo Nordisk, who manufactures Ozempic, has been arguing that, well, I mean, a lot of medicines have a lot of side effects. So this one has this particular side effect, but it has some benefits, so we should just go ahead. So this is the kind of thinking that is there in the pharmaceutical industry now, acceptance of very high levels of side effects. And with the vaccine, it has been particularly horrendous. It's interesting that it seems, for reading the mainstream media on this, there is disquiet now in New Zealand about crops because of our agricultural economy. And in fact, the conversation, which is a very sort of pro-gene publication, has been raising concerns excuse me, other articles have been published too. There have been some articles in some farming publications. People are worried about the possible downside for the economy. We'd lose our so-called clean green image. And that's very important. I used to work in the gene testing industry globally, where our company certified bulk food transactions as free of gene technology. We had to test and then certify, and that there's a lot of consumer resistance. So that kind of concern has come up, and that's good. But there is still a general acceptance that these medical interventions will be wonderful. Well, that's kind of mad, really, because we have just had these 5 years of the pandemic. And we've seen this massive level of side effects. We've seen that the vaccine didn't work, didn't prevent transmission. And now, as time goes by, there was an article the other day admitting, again in the conversation, admitting that a lot of the early articles, scientific articles that were published praising the vaccine, were just simply poor science. Now we're getting more exact assessments, and really it's very, very hard to justify the vaccine on any grounds. It wasn't preventing illness, it wasn't preventing serious side effects, and so on. And when we started out, we said that we're crossing the cell membrane, and everything about our success in life and our aspirations and our rise to higher consciousness, our morality, our intelligence, is all contained in that cell. Well, it turns out studies are now coming out that people who've had the vaccine have suffered a degree of cognitive impairment. And a study of 2 million people in South Korea, looking at their health data, has shown that if you had the vaccine, you're more liable to suffer from anxiety and depression and various other sleep disorders and so on. That just is the tip of the iceberg. That it's affecting one's whole life. That structure, you see, because life has a structure. It's a 3-in-1 structure, and that's reflected in the cell. We've talked about the nucleus, the cytoplasm, and the membrane as a whole system, so 3-in-1. And the wholeness is very, very important. The same with us. We have the knower, the process of knowing, and the known. But it's within one identity. It's within one wholeness of consciousness. These are 3 aspects of who we are, the wholeness of our consciousness. And this is completely omitted from biotechnology. The discussion of consciousness, I mean, can you imagine? It's so utterly ridiculous. Even a child can figure this out. What is the defining characteristic of life? It's awareness, obviously. It's so obvious, it's sort of hitting you in the face and smacking you around, but completely ignored in biotechnology. So they've built this whole kind of system of understanding life as made up of these sort of Lego bricks, these genes. But it's absolutely nothing like a mechanical system at all. It's a system of awareness. That awareness is at the cutting edge of evolution. The decisions that you take in the moment, certainly based on what happened in the past, but your decisions today take you forward. That's your opportunity for change, and it comes from your awareness. So the idea that we could start to discuss life in terms of these genetic building blocks is obviously incomplete. That's And that's the reality we're facing. We're facing a new science that has started off on the wrong foot. And it is absolutely no wonder that they're running into problems.
Okay. Okay. Can you tell me who is pushing this gene technology bill, and why do you think they are pushing it to go through New Zealand Parliament?
Well, I mean, one thing is that it's certainly the pressure has come from overseas. It's certainly on the table in any discussions about a free trade agreement with America. It's there's pressure coming up through the scientific establishment that people really want the opportunity to do whatever they want. When you look at the history of biotechnology, you see people who, they have doubts on their own. Look, this is the code breaker. This is Jennifer Doudna. And I just tell you a bit of a story from this. Doudna, who invented CRISPR gene editing, there was a certain point in 2014 when she realized that this could be completely misused. And she fell asleep one night, and then she dreamt that she was meeting Adolf Hitler, and he was asking her about this gene technology. And he was very interested, and he was writing everything down. And she woke up from this nightmare. She couldn't sleep for months afterwards. She was so freaked out because she absolutely knew that what she discovered could really undermine what life is. And she got the Nobel Prize, by the way, recently. But then she attended a conference at the Silomar in California where people from the whole biotech research community got together. And they all sort of feed off one another with their fantasies of what they can do. I mean, the idea of creating new life is so fascinating for these people. They're immersed in it. The sort of God factor that they absolutely do not want to be stopped or regulated. What they decide at these conferences is absolutely, we do not want to be regulated. So you get pressure from the scientific community. They don't want regulation. You get this kind of economic fantasy from the government that they made so much money during the COVID pandemic. Maybe we could do that. You get pressure from the pharmaceutical industry through its tentacles. And there's not one person here. It's not Judith Collins on her own, although she has obviously been the champion of this. It's a big fantasy, and it's go on.
So is it pharmaceutical companies that are pushing it, or is it some global organization like the WHO that's pushing it?
Oh, I think a lot of people are taken in by this. It's a kind of fantasy. It's the fantasy of eternal life. It's the whole idea that genes encode for specific traits. Well, the fact of the matter is, I mean, there was a program on the TV1 a couple of years ago now, probably, or maybe a year ago, where they were sort of saying, what if we could design our babies to be taller or more intelligent? And as if it was a possibility. Well, you forget about intelligence, it's so complex, but height is affected by tens of thousands of our genes, and we only have 20 or 30,000 genes. And it's the whole idea that one gene encodes for how high you are. It's a ridiculous idea. Actually, multiple genes cooperate with multiple other genes to produce multiple different kinds of effects. So if you alter one gene, you're going to be altering multiple factors inside the body.
Okay, so what was CRISPR supposed to be for? Why did she invent it, and what was her objectives?
Well, CRISPR gene editing is actually comes from the study of bacteria. So bacteria are very destructive. They get into the body and they start cutting and snipping your cells and your genetics. So they have various kinds of mechanisms. You can really rather imagine them as sort of heavily armed samurai warriors that get into your physiology and start sort of swiping away and cutting here and cutting here. And what Doudna realized is that you could take this ability to cut and DNA and kind of harness it, and then you could cut and snip using this bacterial mechanism. Well, at its root, this ability is actually destructive. Bacteria are destructive. So what they're doing is harnessing destructive forces at work in the physiology and using it to try and precisely delete something or cut something and insert something. Okay. So this is what CRISPR essentially is. And there are a number of CRISPR techniques, and they're patented. I mean, there's a lot of money here. I mean, for example, the sickle cell anemia treatment, which gene treatment, which involves the use of CRISPR technology. The licensing fee paid to the patent holders of this particular kind of CRISPR technology was $50 million. So if we in New Zealand developed something using CRISPR, the first thing we'd have to do is check out a lot of money. And in fact, over 80% of gene startups fail to bring anything to market. And of the remaining less than 20%, about 18% that actually produce something, only about 2% manage to sell anything.
Okay. So what benefits, what is the gene technology bill supposed to bring to New Zealand?
Well, according to June Collins, we're going to be curing cancer. We're going to be developing all kinds of technology to fight climate change, and which we're going to sell to the rest of the world and make a huge profit. We're going to, basically the sky's the limit. She has this kind of fantasy along with, which is a PR fantasy. It doesn't bear any relation to actually what is possible using gene technology. She just has this fantasy that is honestly very prevalent all around the world, that everything comes down to genes, and if you can alter genes, you can change life for the better. That's the kind of, it's a simplistic view that bears no relation whatsoever to the published research.
Well, let's try a scenario where a New Zealand doctor uses gene technology, and let's say he does cure cancer. Where would the money go if that technology is already painted up in another place?
But no one's going to be. I mean, there is CAR T-cell technology, which we would have to pay if we used it here. We would have to pay the patent holders. It costs about $850,000 per person. This is a cancer. Most people get immediate benefits and they go into remission. But within a year, all of those people will be back with the cancer. That's what the studies show. So it gives you a temporary remission, and but then the cancer comes back. And this is the cost of one injection is $850,000, which would go overseas, basically.
Okay. And is this primarily aimed at humans, as in medicine, or is it aimed wider, the gene technology? Is it aimed at plants and so on? And
well, there are a lot of people doing work with animals. Obviously, in our economy, there are a lot of people who want to do work with animals and with crops and so on, because that, you know, we're an agricultural economy, and there are people developing things in this field. But this is where there is this growing sort of groundswell of reluctance, because, and I can tell you, having worked in the industry, that there are trade barriers all over the world, and there's consumer resistance. It just happened with Bovir, which is the pill that is being given to cows to stop them burping methane. People just won't buy their milk in the UK and the butter, because consumers are suspicious. So, you know, it's not going to go anywhere. And that's why the bill that is proposed in New Zealand has no provision whatsoever for labeling. So if this bill passed, we won't know what we're eating. We will, nobody will be required to let us know whether we are consuming gene technology.
So apart from the large amounts of money flowing out of New Zealand and the consumer resistance, so what is wrong with gene technology? What are the pitfalls beyond that?
Well, you know, there's a say, I mean, I'm very interested in meditation. And no one understands how our higher capacities as humans, our capacity to reach for the stars, if you like, you know, people like Gandhi or Mandela or, you know, saints in religious traditions, how did they reach the heights of human clarity? What was it about their genes that enabled them to do that? And no one understands that at all. And it's all very delicately balanced. If you start altering that structure, no one understands at all how you're affecting the refinement. Because as humans, we have this self-reflective kind of capacity that animals don't have. Animals are more controlled by the laws of nature, by, you know, they have their path. We have this kind of free will. And what ultimately for us is going to be the effect of this? And then the other thing is that there's this kind of schizophrenia going on at the moment in terms of health. We have this health crisis going on, and then we're seeing lots of articles in the papers saying, oh, you know, it's due to food additives. You've got to have a better diet. You want to eat your fresh fruit and vegetables, and you want to avoid additives and sweeteners, and, you know, all kinds of advice like this. And then on the other hand, you have the government who's who's just suggesting that we be able to alter foods and produce artificial foods without any labeling at all. It's a sort of mad schizophrenia. And the truth is that we rely on fresh foods for our health. We rely on natural foods that we have eaten for millennia. We've co-evolved with the genetic structures in the environment around us. And the studies of you know, general health and so on show quite clearly that people who have a fresh, natural diet are going to live longer. They're going to have less cancer. They're going to have less diabetes. They're going to have a less inflammatory disease. And yet here we are, the government, starting to say, oh, well, we're just going to allow people to do whatever they want, and we're not going to tell the consumer what's going on. And you know, they're appointing a regulator under this bill, but actually he's completely hamstrung, because the bill actually states that most gene technology is not going to require any regulation whatsoever. So anything that's produced using CRISPR technology, the regulator won't even be able to ask questions about it. It's automatically approved.
Hmm.
So this bill is really, I mean, no other country in the world has a bill like this. This is, and to me, that points to overseas influence. People would love to be able to come here to New Zealand and experiment upon the population without having to bother about ethics, safety, risk, or anything like that.
Sorry, does that mean that New Zealand is the first to introduce one of these deregulation bills?
Well, there are other countries that are like the EU and the UK are introducing legislation to deregulate biotechnology, but not like this. They still have the EU, the proposal in the EU still has the precautionary principle, which means it has to be tested and assessed, and it hasn't removed labeling. It just loosened things up a little bit. So we're going the whole hog. Australia has a deregulated to a certain extent deregulated environment, but we are going way beyond Australia.
So how much GMO produce is already in New Zealand? You know, I've heard about soy that's been genetically modified, and the soy basis for formula milk as GMO. Is that a common thing here?
It's hard to tell what we actually buy and how much the government regulates this sector. Yeah, the crops that are regulated are genetically engineered, particularly in quantity, are soy and corn and cotton. Of course, we're not eating cotton, although we are probably eating cottonseed oil. But not all soy and corn and so on is genetically produced, is genetically modified. So we could conceivably be buying food that is, you know, comes from GMO-free sources. And in fact, the safest way to do that is to buy organic.
But do we have any control over the kind of food that comes in that could potentially be unlabeled GMO produce?
I think, you know, going back to 2017, there was this controversy over the Natural Products Bill, and we sort of won that. It's not been passed. But actually, MedSafe just went ahead and approved all kinds of synthetic foods without bothering to, you know, reference the fact that the bill hadn't been passed. So they approved something like 3,000 synthetic ingredients in our food and makeup.
Right.
So that includes things like vanilla. You know, if you buy vanilla ice cream, it doesn't have any vanilla in it anymore. It has something made in a biotech vat. If you're buying cheese, virtually 95 or 96% of all cheese made in New Zealand is made with Pfizer rennet, which is genetically engineered. And you're not told on the label. You have to figure these things out for yourself. The safest thing is to buy organic. More of us have to buy organic. And I do know a lot of people who advocate organic agriculture, and then you go and visit them and you look in their pantry cupboard and it's full of conventional foods because we tend to buy the lowest common denominator. You know, consumers have enormous power. How our choices definitely dictate what gets produced. And if more of us started making more sensible choices about food, our food profile would change. These are the few options that are available to us. Yes, we're going to oppose this bill. Hopefully the whole bill will get kicked out. That's what I'd like to see, or it gets watered down. I don't know. But I have for years now bought organic.
Okay. Before we get on to what can we do about it, there's been a statement humans have been hybridizing food in particular for generations. What's the stark difference between the hybrid foods that we normally eat and the GMO, genetically modified food that's been proposed or could come out of this?
Hybridized food through natural breeding,
Yeah.
which is through natural reproduction. You cross two strains. It happens in nature all the time. It's completely different from gene editing. Gene editing is, by definition, it's mutative. It produces unexpected effects. Nothing like natural breeding. That's another fallacy that the gene industry tries to put about. I mean, one of the things is that, people think that life is random and that gene editing is random, so it's all okay. Life is kind of evolved as a random, but that's actually not the view of modern research on evolution and so on. It's now they've done more sophisticated experiments where if you take a population, people do a lot of work with fruit flies. If you take two populations of fruit flies and you put them in completely different environments, then they evolve on very similar tracks. So it's not that, mistakes in the environment or environmental pressure that is driving evolution. There are underlying laws of nature which play a very significant role in who we are. They've done this with bigger animals too, on where they've evolved on separate islands in different climates, and they found that they go through a very similar evolutionary track. So there's an element of design. We are a reflection of fundamental laws of nature. We've arisen from fundamental laws of nature. And in the same way, everything that goes on in the body is a reflection of the functional elements in that first cell. So you think about it, your heart, your digestive system, your immune system, your brain, they're all a reflection of the structure of a cell. And gene editing is all about altering a cell. And, this is Joe Blow. It's very primitive. Gene editing is Joe Blow tinkering around, wondering what happens. And the whole history of biotechnology is a history of the study of mutations. That since since the very first gene experiments, which occurred 100 years ago, where someone working in Madame Curie's X-ray laboratory decided to irradiate mice to see what would happen. And she irradiated 3,000 mice before she managed to produce one with a short tail. So this was a mutation, and it was achieved by submitting mice to X-rays. And then later, someone decided to sort of look at, because it didn't always work, and the offspring of this mouse didn't always survive. They decided to look at what the remains of the ones who didn't survive, and they found that their whole spine was distorted, their internal organs were kind of mixed up, and this was the beginning of gene. And most of what we know about gene technology has been through the study of mutating animals, and now they've got onto humans. Now for the last 5 years, we've been the subject of an experiment.
So coming back to the bill, what can people do about it? How do they make a submission, and how do they get informed about to make a submission?
You can go to the hatchardreport.com, and we have a gene submission template there, and almost all the releases that I put out in the last 3 weeks, which is probably about 8 or so releases, they have a little paragraph at the end explaining how to make a submission. And you can do it online.
Who initiated this bill was what the first question.
Yeah, I mean, ostensibly it's Judith Collins. And as head of the Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment. But there are people like William Ralston, who used to be the head of farmer, that farming, the farmers group. What's it called? I can't remember. Farmers Federation, who have been pushing this for a long time. And he's got people really worked up because he's talking about there are specific traits like drought resistance and so on that we could be developing here in New Zealand that would be world beaters. But it's sort of fantasy. I mean, who's really made, we're at the premium end of the market here in New Zealand. We are selling produce that we are very protective of. For example, we've just this week, Zespri is suing people in China who have stolen the brand name Zespri, pretending that they're selling Zespri when they're not. We protect our clean green image, our grass-fed cows, our grass-fed milk so carefully. Yeah, we're going to be throwing that away if we start using drought-resistant ryegrass and so on. And people have such sort of dim appreciation of what's involved here. You talk to someone, they say, oh, ryegrass seeds are very heavy. They won't spread very far. Well, genes don't spread through seeds going astray. They spread through cross-pollination, which is spread in the wind. Nothing will stop gene-altered ryegrass here in New Zealand from spreading throughout the whole North and South Islands.
So have the farmers taken a stance on this bill?
Well, they're not universally in favour. They're suspicious of it. There are some people who are very outspoken, like this William Rolleston, and there are people who are very, very misinformed, who think, again. But again, the farming under a GE is a completely different thing. It's not a premium market. This is an area I worked in. This is your bottom rung of agriculture. This is your absolutely bulk production of things that goes into highly processed food, like cornflakes or something like that. That's not a market we're in. Why would we get into that market where we're going to get less for our produce, where we're going to get consumer resistance, and we're going to be paying patent fees overseas? It doesn't make any sense at all.
So are the overseas interests behind it? Could it include people like Pfizer or Moderna or other big farmers?
Well,
or is it Monsanto?
Monsanto. Well, Monsanto is owned by Bayer now, isn't it?
Yeah.
I can tell you a story about Monsanto. Because I worked in Iowa when I worked for Genetic ID. I traveled all over the world, but I was based in Iowa. Well, Monsanto had their headquarters in Iowa, not that far away. If you went to Monsanto's headquarters and you went in their canteen, they only served organic food. Yeah, that they know what they're doing. That's what's so despicable and underhand about this whole thing.
I mean, I remember talking about 20, 30 years ago that the whole GMO crop movement was really made to feed, the starving. It was aimed at what we used to call the third world, to be Africa and parts of Asia, as to increase things like golden rice and so forth. But where there was no need for it in Europe, that's why the Europeans were dead against it. like New Zealand, Europe was in a premium market for agriculture rather than bulk.
No, and no one was ever producing this for ethical reasons. They were trying to make money. For God's sake, I knew these people.
Right.
They wanted to make money. I mean, that what motivates a lot of these people? They have to keep their jobs. When COVID came up, I was talking to people in gene therapy, and they were really worried about this, the safety of the vaccine. They knew that, right off, the people at the top of gene technology, gene therapy, medical research knew very quickly that this came out of a lab. They did their test, but what they said to me is, for God's sake, don't mention my name. I might lose my job.
Okay. Can people make an oral submission against this bill?
You can tick a box which enables you to speak to your submission. You don't have to do that, but you can. I mean, this is a health select committee process. You'll get 5 minutes, and maybe one person will listen to you as you speak. I'm sorry, I'm a bit of a cynic. I've spent my life making submissions, and my conclusion is, you have to take your decisions for yourself. You have to place yourself in this world in a place where it aligns with what you're thinking, because that is when you do something that you don't really want to do, it twists you up. You have to be completely thorough about where you stand. And that is what truth is. Truth is what exists.
So how much attention will Parliament pay to submissions, whether it's written or oral?
Well, what we're hoping is, are there enough submissions that they think, oh, wait a minute, this is kind of there's a political downside here. Because it's all about votes, and most people don't bother. So when they get a lot of letters or a lot of submissions, they know that there are a lot more people who feel the same way.
Yeah. So are there any MPs other than Judith Collins taking sides on this bill?
Yeah. I mean, the Labour and the Greens voted against it, and Debati Maori. The New Zealand First, there's Tanya Unkovich. There are some Labour MPs that have written to me. There are some, there are some national MPs who are concerned. A friend of mine met with his local MP in Auckland the other day, in National Party MP, and showed them the Pfizer post-marketing adverse effect report from 2021 with the huge list of side effects that they'd noticed. And the guy was horrified. And he said, I've heard nothing about this bill. He said, they keep us very busy as MPs. He's a new MP. They keep us very busy. And the only thing I've heard about this bill is that it's going to be an economic miracle for New Zealand. That was all he knew about it. And he was absolutely horrified that there were even side effects from the vaccine. I mean, they live in a bubble. For goodness sake. I mean, goodbye.
Well, they've got their own pet projects, so whatever their pet beliefs are, that's what they'll go for. And so there's so many bills going through Parliament, they won't necessarily focus on many of them.
Yeah, and there are others who are totally for it. Yeah, obviously. There are other national MPs. There was another one, a friend of mine went to see him, and happened to know his wife too, his wife is a kind of advocate of natural food. And so he said he was talking to him about the bill, and he said, have you told your wife about what's going on? He said, no, I'm not going to tell her. She'll get worried. And I thought, well, what kind of person is that they don't share things with their wife?
Okay, so is it true that a free trade agreement with the USA is at stake here? And it's been pushed on that basis?
Yeah, it could be. Certainly in terms of the Biden administration. The Biden administration considered biotechnology to be one of the main development areas of the US economy. I don't think that that is so true of the Trump administration, but time will tell. That you've, yeah. I mean, Trump's positives and negatives. I don't know which way the new government will go, but it is a huge industry in the US, and the US holds most of the patents.
And a wider issue, is it true that the Ardern government tried to buy your silence?
My silence?
Yeah.
Well, no, I never received any money from at the beginning. I was just reading this stuff today, my correspondence. At the beginning, I was invited to correspond with people in the SCEG committee who were advising the government. And also, the SCEG committee was the government. It was the first committee that made recommendations about the vaccine to the government. Mm-hmm. And so I corresponded with them for quite some time, but it wasn't long before I realized that they were just vaccine stooges, and they were never going to acknowledge. In fact, one of the members of the committee said to me, "Yeah, I know there are problems, but they'll get it right in the end. Don't worry." That was the level of disregard that went on. Whereas from a scientific perspective, it was obvious this was novel technology. It was obvious that this hadn't had any long-term testing. It was obvious if you looked at the past publishing and the animal trials that there were problems with the technology. Why was this ignored? Hard to say, really.
It was certainly pushed, but we've already been experimented on, haven't we, in terms of genetic modification?
Yeah, absolutely. And the studies show that some of this genetic material has the capacity to integrate into our genome. And what it does there, no one has really properly evaluated. And then so many families have been affected by this.
Right. And is the government aware of this now? They're in denial about there are any adverse effects. And when they first brought out the vaccine, it was the safe and effective mantra that was repeated again and again. And when people try to raise the issue of these adverse effects, they're kind of shunned and silenced in there.
Yeah, it's still the situation. There's still, people like me who raise these issues, we're cancelled.
Right.
Someone asked, someone the other day, a person wrote to me and said they'd gone up to the stand at their AMP show from the ACT Party and then the National Party, and the National Party said, "Oh, it's all outdated fear mongering," and the ACT Party said, "Oh, Hatchard, he's a mad conspiracy theorist who doesn't have a PhD." Well, I do have a PhD, and I have a distinguished career, and I'm a published researcher. But that's their level. They've descended to ad hominem. They've closed their eyes. They've stuck their head in the sand. They don't want to know, because if it comes out, they're going to look awful, and no one wants to look awful.
But they're still pushing this. Come get your COVID booster.
Yeah, absolutely. They're pushing a new vaccine. I see. You get these little announcements through your cell phone telling you to toddle on down and get your JN1 revised Pfizer COVID vaccine. If you really and it actually says there, if you're 12 years old or plus, you'll need to have one of these every 6 months. Well, fortunately, not a lot of people are falling for that these days.
Yeah, and it's not just for COVID. They're pushing it for other. There seems to be a new vaccine out every month for. Well, the last one was whooping cough, then it was measles, then it was shingles, and so on. And I'm guessing these are all the new technology rather than more traditional vaccines.
You'd have to look into each one and find out what's going on. As I say, we started out saying there's just an acceptance of very high level of adverse effects, and oh, that's okay. Well, it's not okay, is it? I mean, I'm tempted to start using some words that I shouldn't use.
Another question that's popped up is this gene technology bill intended to advance and normalize the transhuman agenda?
Transhumanism is a good term, I think, because if you think that humans are random, they can be just sort of mucked around. I don't think that. I think, human life is sacred. Myself, I believe it's a sacred trust, and I absolutely, I've got a long-standing interest in meditation all my life, and there's a saying in the Bhagavad Gita, which comes from the Vedic tradition, which says that it's better death in your own dharma than it is to take the dharma of another, which, it means that dharma means life path. So it says it's better to die in your own, as who you are, and than to try and be something that you you try and take the life of another person, which is really what this is all about. In fact, the Bhagavad Gita forms the central core of an epic work about a great war that occurred 5,000 years ago, and the remains of that war are still archaeologically there. Massive war. And the story of how the war emerged is very interesting. There is a description in the Mahabharata of the use of cloning. There were 100 sons of a king were cloned, and it actually has quite a detailed description of the process. And the eldest son was called Duryodhana, and he was the cause of this absolutely massive war, this conflagration. And at one point, he was sort of asked about why was he causing this massive problem, obviously doing things that were going to lead to war. And he said, I know what is right, but I can't do it. I know what is wrong, but I can't refrain from it. And he was a cloned man. He didn't have an innate sense of morality. So this is from the historical record of an ancient civilization. You can take it as you like. This is not something new. We have the human race has a very, very long history. And these things have a habit of coming up.
Okay. Going back to the questions. So regarding all the injuries and disease from the novel mRNA COVID vaccines, such as turbo cancers, do you think that we could be just at the tip of the iceberg, i.e. there could be a coming avalanche of illnesses and diseases? Not the alternative, that is, no, it's all right, it's peaked. Is it on the ascendance? Is it all over?
Here in New Zealand, we wouldn't know. We have to look overseas. In Sweden, for example, there was an 11% increase in cancer incidence in 2022, and 2023 there was a further 11% increase in cancers. And so we haven't, in some of the countries that are releasing data, we're not seeing lessening. We're not seeing it accelerating particularly, but it's hard to say. Here in New Zealand, we're clearly in a health crisis. I've got two friends today who are both in hospital, and I've been talking to them on the phone. They just went into hospital after accidents, and it's bedlam in hospitals. They're just completely overwhelmed.
Sorry,
But
what are they overwhelmed
we're
with?
not.
What are they overwhelmed with?
Well, we're getting reports from oncologists and from the leaked data from the help from the insurance companies, leaked information rather than data, that there is a problem with cancer. We definitely know that cardiac issues are way up.
Yeah.
We know for sure from official data that mental health problems have increased dramatically. So there's been, there are now 49,000 people in New Zealand of working age who are unable to work because of psychiatric issues. We've seen since the beginning of the pandemic, we've seen a 58% increase in incapacity to work among the age group 18 to 24. Now that's extraordinary. It's absolutely extraordinary that young people would be, there would be that much increase in incapacity to work. It's at record levels and the government can hardly cope with it. So we are seeing long-term issues, and we only hope that this is going to level off, but we don't know yet. And here in New Zealand, there's so much data that's being hidden and manipulated. It's very easy to manipulate this kind of data. I mean, this is a field I've worked in all my life, data. One of the first things that you do when you are investigating a phenomenon, I used to do research on crime. That means, sort of demographic influence on crime trends. The first thing you do is that you verify that the data you've been given or that is published is real. And you go and you interview the people who are collecting the data in the police. Mm. And you find out whether they've changed their categories or criteria. Mm. We don't have that option here in New Zealand. Right. Everything is hidden now. It's all been, swept under the carpet. So we don't know. We do know through an OIA, official information request, that the incidence of chest pain has gone through the roof. So the incidence of people reporting to ED departments with chest pain has gone from 2,000 a year to 40,000 a year in the under 40-year-old category.
Sorry, can you repeat those numbers? It's gone from
the
2,000...
incidence of people attending A&E with chest pain in New Zealand among under 40-year-olds has gone from 2,000 people a year in 2019 to 30,000. I think it's 30,000 people in 2023.
And this is young people, not the elderly you're looking at.
Yeah, this is under 40s.
Yeah.
And why? Why has it happened? There's no one's talking about it. And instead we get this insipid announcements from the government that it's due to the inefficiency of the health service, these waiting lists, these long ED waits, and that we're going to make the health service more efficient. It's insipid. They're treating us like little children. We're not daft.
So we've seen increases in heart problems. We've seen increases in cancer, in particular more aggressive cancers, and aggressive cancers, late stage development in younger people. Is that right?
We don't have much data on cancer. We don't
Right.
have much data on cancer. We've seen it overseas, but we don't have New Zealand data on cancer. Just the other day, they released 2021 and 2022 cancer data, but it doesn't make. I've just started looking at it. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It. I have queries about the data, but I've no one I can ask about it.
All right. All right. Has there
Well,
been
I
any?
do know cancer has increased, but
Yeah.
what I don't know is how they're reporting it.
All right. Is there any data on fertility impacts or miscarriages? So
Yeah, that comes out every quarter. So we've got a decreasing level of fertility. Fertility in New Zealand is at its lowest all-time level.
okay. Another question is, might we be already eating animals and animal products that have been gene altered?
No, I don't think so. I mean, most animals, when they're gene altered, they die young.
Right.
There hasn't really entered the food chain gene altered animals.
A bit of a naive question, but if the animals are eating genetically modified feed, would that affect them?
It could affect their milk, and it could affect them, yes.
Hmm.
But we don't understand how. There's very little research on that. I mean, there's some animal studies that show that organ size might change slightly, or I'm a vegetarian. So
Right.
I'm a lifelong vegetarian.
All right. All right. So a roundabout question is there potential in this technology to create aberrations, i.e. chimeras, with this type of technology?
Chimeras, well, it's interesting. Chimeras, actually a term because there are some people who have more than one set of DNA and they're called chimeras. That's actually quite common.
Right.
And it's because it's a sort of freak of reproduction where um, it's hard to understand, really. I mean, I haven't looked at it in very great detail, but it occurs somehow when two different eggs get fertilized by two different sperm, but then they fuse together in the womb in the very, very early stages, and the person ends up with two sets of DNA. And what the characteristics of those people are, I don't really know. Are we going to get, it's well, one thing I can say is that I gene altered animals have not proved to live very long. So once you gene alter someone, it's not really very stable.
Yeah.
And there's another factor here that it's very, very speculative. And again, it's something I've done a little research on. Is it seems to me that there are genetic fields, there are biofields that we are connected together with others of our species, and especially with our relatives. I don't know whether any of you have ever had experiences, but I have, of events occurring at a great distance within my family, and then I'm aware what has gone on. When my grandfather died, I knew the instant he died. And then the phone rang, and it was my father. I picked it up. I said, and I didn't even know my grandfather was ill. And I said, I know why you're calling. My grandfather just died.
All right.
Because we're connected. My mother, when I went into hospital, I was working in Sydney years ago, and I had to go into hospital unexpectedly. And my mother phoned that night, my wife, and she said, "How's Guy?" I said, "I'm really worried about him." So we're connected. There are biofields.
Oh yeah.
That connect us all together, and these are very fundamental fields, and they seem to, from my research, they seem to be much stronger if you're related, if you come from, it, it's a complex subject. I'd have to take a long time talking about it, but basically, if people have been settled in an area for a long time, they start to share genetic characteristics, and you form a collective consciousness there. For example, if you go to a place like Merseyside, where people have been, it's quite a settled population there, and they have distinct genetic characteristics which people share, and it forms and supports a mutually supportive collective consciousness.
Okay. Could this bill lead to mandatory blood tests or even mandatory vaccines? Is there anything in the bill?
The minister is granted very general powers under this bill to grant emergency authorizations of medical interventions. Yes, he is.
Oh,
and
wow.
it's very vaguely worded, which gives him, with the more vaguely worded it is, the more general the powers that he acquires as a result of it.
Yeah. Yeah. We're thinking surely doctors and nurses and certainly those working in the hospital system would have worked out or joined the dots regarding these mRNA vaccines and the big increase in illnesses. Are they not saying so? Are they keeping quiet?
Well, as you know, I was ill last year, and I did spend quite a lot of time in hospitals. I did encounter some people who were unvaccinated and still working in the hospital system. Obviously, we got exemptions, and were very clued up. Interestingly, I mean, there are people in the nursing system I met who were well aware that something had gone wrong, that the number of people coming in with heart problems, for example, was very high. I remember one lady who was a senior nurse saying to me, she said it's like being in Sniper Alley. She said you don't know who's going to get hit next.
Right.
And so they are aware of it, but they're so busy. These are dedicated people, and they're so busy, and there's no encouragement from higher up to ask questions. In fact, if you ask questions, you might lose your job.
Okay. Another question. If all animals die after gene therapy, why aren't all humans who've been injected with the mRNA dead already?
No, not all animals die. They mostly they have shorter lives. We're actually seeing that, but mRNA technology is not full-blown gene therapy.
Right.
We're not replacing a person's genes or cloning human bodies. I was particularly referring to cloned animals. Cloned animals tend to have short lives.
Right. So this goes beyond, or the bill goes way beyond what we've already seen in terms of mRNA gene technology.
Yeah, it does. Absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, it's just sort of, and it says, they say we're appointing a regulator who, is going to make sure it's all safe and jolly for everybody. The regulator doesn't have a lot of powers, actually. Most things are just, he has to approve. He's mandated, he has to approve them. And he can be overruled by the minister.
So what's the point of a regulator if he doesn't have any powers to regulate it, and he has to give permission to companies?
And he has to give permission if two countries overseas approve a medical technology. He has to approve it. Precisely. What is the point? This is not a well thought out bill.
Will companies need a license to practice this technology? Or is it?
It's very this is a carte blanche. That's how I read it. It's not a lot of restriction there. And look, the regulator who gets appointed, he's just going to become a rubber stamper.
Right.
He's the clear intention of the bill is to completely free up gene technology from regulation. So whoever they appoint is going to be someone who knows what the government's intention is, and he's going to go along with it. This is why we have to write in and oppose the bill. Honestly, we absolutely can't accept this.
All right. Somebody's asked, what about the body of 12 scientists? Not sure what she means by that.
I've no idea. No
idea
what that means.
Okay.
Do 12 scientists share one body? Yeah. I don't know. Sorry. If COVID was just a lethal virus, why then did people only die of COVID in hospitals and not in the streets or at home, for example? Well, a lot of people did die at home. But whether they died at home of COVID or the COVID vaccine is another whole other question. The thing was that most people who did die, who were designated to have died of COVID, had comorbidities.
Mm-hmm.
They already had problems with their lungs, they had autoimmune disease, they had diabetes, they had heart disease, they were on their last legs anyway. I mean, right at the beginning, the average age of people dying at COVID was 82 years old, which is actually older than the normal life expectancy, which is around 80.
Okay. So back to the body of 12 scientists. Its source is Radio New Zealand. It's the body of 12 scientists is supposed to be working alongside the regulator. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, could be. I mean, look, it's a stitch up. just that's all I can say. It's a stitch up. I mean, these people are just going to say, yes, we'll do that. Yes. Well, this is what I was saying about these conferences. You get all these people together and they all say, oh, well, that's okay. That's okay. We don't want to be told what to do. We're saving the world.
Mm. That's
the narrative, that we're saving the world. This is what they've been taught since they went to school. The biology, the very first lessons they have on biology. I know I've got grandkids. They start telling you all kinds of Banbury tales about how people will be more intelligent and live longer lives and blah blah blah. Sorry, I'm being a bit. Undoubtedly the regulator will be working alongside a group of people, but most of the cases of gene technology will not even come in front of the regulator. They will be mandated.
Okay. Right.
The process is not outlined in the bill. So this is a enabling act. This is an act that enables something to take place. It doesn't really regulate it. It's an enabling act. When Hitler came to power, he passed the Enabling Act, which enabled him to do whatever he wanted to do. He was appointed as the man who could take decisions. And we have the same situation here. The government can appoint someone who will decide what to do. And whether he has 12 advisors or 112 advisors doesn't really matter. He's not obliged by the bill to follow their advice. There is no process specified in this bill.
Okay, all right. Well, let's wrap up the first section. I'm going to stop the recording, and then you can relax and we'll go for more general conversation in there.